In the third week of March 1908, a well driller named Amos Tabor was hired to sink a water well on the Caswell farm outside Pall Mall, in Fentress County, Tennessee, on the western edge of the Cumberland Plateau. The Caswells needed water for a new barn and had picked a spot 40 yards from the spring house, on ground that sloped gently toward a dry creek bed. Tabor had drilled wells across 3 counties for 11 years and knew the rock under that ground by feel long before the bit reached it. Sandstone near the surface, then a band of shale, then the grey limestone that held most of the plateau's water. His rig was a horse-powered spring pole outfit, slow work by hand and gearing, and he expected to be at the Caswell place the better part of a week. The farm sat at the end of a wagon road 2 miles from the nearest neighbour, ringed by second-growth timber that had never been cleared for anything larger than a corn patch, the kind of ground nobody in Fentress County had ever bothered to survey closely. On the 4th day of drilling, at a depth of 38 feet, the auger stopped biting. It did not strike rock, the way rock resists a bit. It slid, the way metal slides across something already smooth. Tabor pulled the string and found no rock chips in the cuttings, only a fine white powder, dry and warm to the touch even though the bore sat well below the frost line. He lowered a hand auger the rest of the way himself, turning it slowly, and at 38 feet and some inches it stopped cold against a surface that would not give another quarter inch no matter how hard he leaned on it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Tabor called for 2 more men and a shovel crew, and by the following afternoon they had opened a pit 6 feet across down to the stopping point. What the pit exposed was not bedrock. It was a floor. The surface was pale grey marble, veined in streaks of white and faint rose, cut into slabs roughly 2 feet on a side, and fitted so closely that Tabor said afterward he could not work the blade of a pocket knife into the seam between 2 of them. The slabs were polished smooth on the top face, the kind of finish that takes a stonecutter days to raise on a single block, and they ran level in every direction the pit exposed, without a crack, without a single slab sitting a hair higher or lower than the one beside it. Marble of that kind was not unfamiliar to the region. Quarries around Hawkins County and along the Holston River Valley, nearly 140 miles to the east, had been cutting and shipping Tennessee marble since before the war, stone that ended up in courthouse floors and bank lobbies as far away as Washington. But there was no quarry on the Cumberland Plateau, no marble bed recorded anywhere near Fentress County, and no history of any building, church, courthouse, or foundation ever standing on the Caswell property or the land around it. A polished marble floor, fitted without mortar, lay under nearly 40 feet of undisturbed plateau soil in a county with no marble of its own and no record of anyone ever quarrying, hauling, or laying stone there. Tabor later told Bunton that the strangest part was not the stone itself, but the silence of it. No mortar crumbs, no chips, no waste rock of the kind any quarrying or dressing job leaves behind, nothing scattered on or around the floor to suggest that whoever had cut and set those slabs had ever worked within reach of where they now lay buried. The dirt directly above the marble held no charcoal, no broken pottery, no bone, no metal, nothing that a farmstead, a camp, or even a brief human visit tends to leave in the ground. It was simply floor, and then simply soil, with nothing in between to explain how one had come to rest under 40 feet of the other. Word reached the county seat at Jamestown within the week, carried by a Caswell cousin who clerked at the general store. The county surveyor, a man named Elzie Bunton, rode out to see the pit for himself, and by his own account, climbed down into it with a lantern and worked the exposed section on his knees, running a hand along every seam he could reach. Bunton was no geologist, but he had surveyed enough county land to know that nothing in the local rock record produced a flat, polished surface, and he wrote to the state government in Nashville asking that someone from the newly organized Tennessee Division of Geology come look before the Caswells filled the pit back in to keep their stock from wandering into it. A state geologist named Coleman Vance arrived at the end of March, spent 2 days at the site, and according to a letter Bunton later sent his brother in Kentucky, left with several fragments of the marble packed into a wooden crate, along with a set of measurements and photographs. Vance told Bunton before he left that the stone had been dressed and finished the way a mason dresses a floor, not the way weathering or mineral deposit shapes a natural surface. Bunton asked what that meant for a floor sitting under 40 feet of soil with no structure above it and no quarry within 100 miles. Vance did not answer. He thanked Bunton for his time, loaded the crate onto a wagon, and left for Nashville. He never published a report on the Caswell site. No photograph or measurement from his visit has ever turned up in the Division of Geology's surviving early 20th century files. Bunton's letter to his brother, the only surviving first-hand account of Vance's 2 days at the Caswell farm, describes the geologist as businesslike to the point of coldness, a man who measured, photographed, and packed without once expressing the surprise Bunton felt standing beside him. Vance brought his own assistant, a younger man Bunton names only as Pruitt, who did most of the measuring while Vance directed him and made notes in a leather-bound book that never left his coat pocket. Bunton asked twice whether the state intended to send a larger team, given what they had found. Both times Vance said only that the matter would be looked into further in Nashville. No further visit ever came. The Register of Deeds for Fentress County kept a continuous ledger of land transactions, boundary surveys, and mineral filings from the 1880s forward, bound in yearly volumes and stored at the courthouse in Jamestown. The volume covering the first half of 1908 survives today, but the entries for March of that year are missing. The book itself was never damaged. The pages before March 1st and after March 31st are intact. Same hand, same ink, filed in the same order as every other month in the volume. The month in between simply is not there, 4 leaves removed cleanly enough that the binding shows no tear, only a gathering slightly narrower than it should be, where the missing sheets used to sit. No fire touched the Fentress County courthouse that year. No flood reached the record room. The clerk on duty in 1908, a woman named Ida Pyle, kept her post for another 11 years and left no letter, note, or later account explaining the gap. Her successor inherited a ledger with a hole in it and, as far as any surviving record shows, never once asked why. The Jamestown weekly paper for that spring shows a similar hole. Bound volumes of the paper survive at a regional library going back to 1895, 1 issue a week, filed in order. The issue for the last week of March 1908, the same week Bunton wrote to Nashville and Vance made his trip, is simply absent from the bound run, with the issue before it and the issue after it stitched together at the spine, as though nothing had ever sat between them. No library record explains when or why that single issue went missing. Coleman Vance, for his part, left the Division of Geology within 4 years of the Caswell visit and took a desk position with a railroad survey office in Chattanooga, work that had nothing to do with mineral or stone examination. Colleagues who wrote about him later, in a 1940 State Geological Society memorial notice, praised his fieldwork on coal seams and river grading, but made no mention of 1908 at all, and no later interview, letter, or published paper by Vance ever returns to the subject of a marble floor in Fentress County. The Caswell floor was not the only one. In the autumn of 1911, 3 years later, and 80 miles to the northwest, a sinkhole opened overnight on a farm in Barron County, Kentucky, swallowing part of a hayfield. When the farmer climbed down to see what had opened under his land, he found the sinkhole floor was not raw limestone, but a section of fitted stone, grey and polished, running beneath the collapsed ground and continuing under the undisturbed field on either side. A county surveyor examined it within the week, and a short item ran in a bowling green paper describing a stone floor of, quote, unknown origin and considerable age, found beneath a collapsed field. No follow-up story ever ran. The county surveyor who examined the Barron County floor, a man whose name the newspaper item never printed, is quoted only once, telling the reporter that the stone reminded him of, quote, a courthouse floor without the courthouse. The sinkhole was filled the next spring at the farmer's own expense, and no state geological survey record from that period mentions the Barron County site at all, though a private letter from the farmer to a cousin in Nashville, preserved by his descendants, repeats the same detail Tabor and Bunton had already put in writing 80 miles away. No mortar, no waste stone, no trace of the hands that must have cut and set it. In 1926, cave surveyors mapping a limestone system in Fannin County, Georgia, broke through a thin wall of rock into a chamber and found its floor covered edge to edge in the same style of fitted, polished stone, this time pale rose instead of grey. The surveyor's own trip log, kept today by a regional caving club, describes the floor as, quote, too flat and too fitted to be anything the cave made on its own, and notes measurements of the slab joints running within a 1/16 of an inch of one another across the width of the chamber, a tolerance the log's author called, quote, better than most masons manage today with steel tools and a level. The chamber was resealed with quarried rubble within the month on the property owner's order, no reason given, and none of the surveyors who mapped it were invited back. 3 sites, 3 states, 3 decades apart, and in every case the same shape. A polished stone floor found somewhere it should not exist, examined briefly by whoever held the authority to examine it, and then closed, filled, or put back out of reach before anyone outside the immediate area got a look for themselves. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. When Tabor's crew dug the Caswell pit, one of the shovel hands, a young man named Silas Doss, pried loose a broken corner of one slab, roughly the size of a dinner plate, meaning to keep it before the state geologist arrived and took what remained. Doss kept the fragment on his mantle for the rest of his life. It passed to his daughter, then to her son, and as of the most recent account given to a regional folklore researcher in the 1990s, it still sits in a family home in Fentress County, a piece of pale grey, white-veined marble, with one broken edge, and one edge still polished glass, smooth, never tested in any laboratory, never handed over to any museum, never examined by anyone equipped to say where the stone actually came from. It is the only physical piece of the Caswell floor known to have survived Coleman Vance's visit, the one fragment the state never got its hands on because a shovel hand pocketed it before anyone in authority arrived to take an inventory. The folklore researcher who documented the fragment in the 1990s described it in her own field notes as heavier than its size suggested, dense in the hand in a way that ordinary building marble is not, and noted that the family had never allowed it out of the house, not for a county historical display, not for a university geology department that asked to borrow it in 1983. The family's answer both times was the same one Doss himself is said to have given as an old man, that the state had already taken everything else from that hole in the ground, and they intended to keep the one piece that was theirs. The plateau soil above the floor, in every account of the dig, showed no disturbance beyond what 40 feet of ordinary deposition produces on its own. No fill line, no old excavation scar, no debris layer marking where a structure once stood and later fell or got buried. The floor was not the remnant of a building that collapsed and was covered by later soil. It sat clean, level, and undisturbed, the way a floor sits when nothing above it has ever been built or destroyed, only accumulated over it, grain by grain, for far longer than anything on the Cumberland Plateau is supposed to have stood. Geologists studying the plateau's soil horizons in the decades since have placed the rate of undisturbed accumulation above bedrock at roughly 1 inch every 2 to 3 centuries under stable forest cover, depending on slope and rainfall. 40 feet of undisturbed soil, by that measure, points toward many thousands of years of continuous deposition above whatever the marble floor was originally built to be part of, long before any culture credited to the region is recorded as quarrying and dressing stone on the Cumberland Plateau, and long before anyone in that record is known to have owned tools capable of holding a fit that tight across a floor that size. A floor built on the surface of the plateau at that depth in time would have stood in a landscape the region's own geological survey describes as colder, wetter, and more heavily glaciated at its margins than anything the Cumberland Plateau has seen since. It would predate every settlement horizon ever excavated in the region, predate the earliest fluted points found along the Cumberland and Obed rivers, predate, by the Plateau's own soil clock, any structure the official record credits to a human hand in that part of Tennessee. A floor at that depth does not ask to be explained away as a forgotten farmhouse. It asks how a level, mortar-free, 1/16 of an inch tolerance surface came to exist at all, on ground that supposedly held nothing but forest and game trails for the whole of recorded time, and it asks that question in 3 different states, under 3 different jurisdictions, decades apart, with no committee, no shared office, and no single hand behind the resealing of any of them. The Caswell floor does not fit into a barn foundation, a root cellar, or any structure a 19th century farm family might have built and forgotten about. It does not match any documented settlement pattern for the Plateau, which built in timber, hide, and fieldstone, not quarried and polished marble laid without mortar. It does not match the output of any marble quarry ever recorded in Tennessee, none of which operated within 100 miles of Fentress County, and none of which produced the tight, mortar-free fit that Tabor and Bunton each described independently, in separate accounts, years apart. What it does match, in Coleman Vance's own words to Bunton before he drove off with the crate, is the work of a mason, stone-dressed and fitted the way a floor gets dressed and fitted when it is meant to be walked on, in a room, by people, for a purpose the soil above it no longer records. Amos Tabor finished the well he had been hired to drill. He moved his rig 30 feet north, sank a new bore through ordinary rock, and struck water at 52 feet, exactly the kind of well the Caswells had asked him for in the first place. He never spoke publicly about the pit or the floor underneath it, and the only written account of what he saw survives second-hand, through Bunton's letter to his brother, a letter that made it down to us by accident, tucked in a family trunk in Kentucky, rather than any archive built to keep it safe. The pit itself was filled within the month, on Bunton's own recommendation, to keep livestock from falling in. 40 feet of Cumberland Plateau soil now sits again above a marble floor that a county surveyor once touched with his bare hands, that a state geologist photographed and then never described in writing, and that a missing month in a courthouse ledger has never explained. No drill, no auger, no survey crew has gone looking for that floor again in over a century, and the Caswell farm itself passed out of the family in the 1950s, its exact boundaries blurred by later resurveys that never mention a pit, a floor, or anything unusual about the ground at all. Somewhere in Fentress County, in a house that has passed through 3 generations of one family, a broken piece of that floor still sits on a shelf, the only proof anyone kept, because the men with the authority to keep proof chose instead to fill the hole back in. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.